Hello, this is Washington Unplugged. I'm John Dickerson, sitting in for Bob Schieffer. For 47 years, the United States has had an embargo with Cuba. This week, President Obama lifted some restrictions on the communist country. Cuban Americans who wish to travel to the island and send money home to their relatives can now do so more easily. U.S. telecommunications firms can also start making deals there. I'm here with New Jersey Congressman Chris Smith, who thinks this is not a good idea at all, and also Illinois Congressman Bobby Rush, who was in Cuba last week and met with the Castro brothers. Congressman Smith, I want to start with you. Your reaction to President Obama's...
Well, I actually voted or offered an amendment back in 2001 that it would have lifted the travel ban, but if and only if certain conditions were met, especially as it relates to release of the political prisoners and other human rights criteria. There should have been a serious negotiation, and at the conclusion of that, we would have gotten to the point where the travel ban was lifted. I'm concerned that exit permits given to Cubans to travel outside the country will only be limited to those men and women who silence themselves about human rights. That has been the practice years to date. And in terms of Cubans going into the country, if they're involved in any way with human rights advocacy or have relatives who are in prison, who are part of the pro-democracy movement, forget it. You're not going to get a visa from the Cuban government. They also, in Cuba, hold back the children. When people travel abroad, even now, the Cuban government says your kids stay behind as hostages. So only some Cubans will get there. Added to that, the remittances that are sent to Cuban families, about 20% of that money is stolen by the Cuban government. You talk about a fee, a tax, just for sending the money from, say, a relative in America to somewhere else on the island. 20% goes right into the coffers of the Castro brothers.
Congressman Rush, you were just there on this question of humanitarian rights and political prisoners. What can you tell us about your meeting with the Castros? There is reporting that this issue didn't even come up, that they weren't asked about this. What's your view on this?
Well, let me just say this. I certainly have been an advocate for human rights all of my adult life. I mean, I was a product of the 60s and the civil rights movement. Been involved in supporting human rights for the last 50, 60 years. So human rights issues are definitely in the forefront, in the center of what I do. However, I do believe that this is an issue that has been used to stymie the productive discussions. This is a new day. Human rights is on the table. Raul Castro issued a statement today where he said that everything was open for discussion. Everything is up for discussion. So let's begin to discuss these matters. I believe that what we need to do is, first of all, Cuba is not a terrorist state. It needs to come off the list of terrorist states. There's no rhyme nor reason for Cuba to be on the list of terrorist states.
But Congressman,
look, please let me finish. There are every nation in the world, noteworthy nation in the world, every nation in the world, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, Latin America, all these nations have normal trade relationships with Cuba. Only the U.S. And why is that? Because we've been stuck in the past with a policy that says that we won't open up discussions at this level. We won't engage in conversation. We won't engage in meaningful exchange. And it's a new day. This is the dawning of a new day. There's a new epoch that's approaching the world now, and let's open up these discussions and have them.
We're going to open up discussion. Let me just quickly, though, given your history with human rights and your attention to it, though, can you give us some assessment based on your visit about the conditions there? I know you want to look forward.
Our visit there was cut short because the president, the administration called and said that they needed the plane back. We did not go outside of Havana.
Okay.
So we didn't have a chance to meet with a number of organizations that we were scheduled to meet with.
Okay.
But, notwithstanding that, and let me just say this. As an African American, as an activist, as a person who once belonged to an organization that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI said was the #1 threat to national security, I'm not getting ready to buy into some of these arguments because I know I never was a threat.
Let me get Congressman Smith's reaction to what you said.
Well, John, first of all, I believe that if you look at the record I have tried repeatedly, along with Congressman Frank Wolf, to get to Cuba, to get a visa from the Cuban government, and have been denied every time. We tried most recently in February. We were turned down flat. Why? Because we want to visit political prisoners, prisoners of conscience. There's a man named Artunez. He has spent 17 years in political prisons, has been tortured and mistreated. He's now out of prison. He has a hunger strike. And he and his group of human rights defenders are surrounded by secret police. I would make an appeal to the American media, to CBS in particular, respectfully. Tell the story of the dissidents. Dr. Oscar Bichette, an Afro-Cuban who was arrested in and out of prison 18 times in 2003 in a massive crackdown by the secret police in Cuba, got 25 years. He's a medical doctor. Many of us, including me, he's my adopted prisoner of conscience, believe that he may die. He has been so mistreated. And why does Bobby Rush, my good friend and colleague, why does Bobby Rush get into Cuba when people like myself, and I have a history, 29 years in Congress, of promoting human rights. I actually visited Perm Camp 35 in the Ural Mountains. Let me just say, all these years pushing human rights, anti-human trafficking, religious freedom. Here we have a situation where if we would just demand to go to these prison camps and argue for their release.
Let's let Congressman Rush, please respond, Congressman Rush.
There are nations in the world who has more and more flagrant violations of human rights. And we have normal trade relationships with them. Shall I remind you that Saudi Arabia has a vicious attitude toward women that's almost inhumane? May I remind you that China has a horrible human rights record? But we have normal trade relations. As a matter of fact, we're in our national debt. A significant portion of our national debt.
I would argue, and I take the point, Bobby.
We owe to China.
All right,
but here's the point.
Korea, here's the point. There are countries all across the world.
Here's the point.
Congressman Rush, let's have him
There
respond.
should be a lessons learned from our coddling of the dictatorship in China. They have gotten demonstrably worse. When Bill Clinton delinked human rights with trade and granted them unfettered MFN, most favored trading status, which is now called permanent normal trading relationship, and that was carried on by the Bush administration as well. We just threw in the towel and said human rights are a footnote. Recently, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was actually in Beijing, and while she was there or on her way, she said human rights will not distract. It will not be, get in the way of selling treasury bonds. We have unfortunately put human rights somewhere in the back pages.
In this case,
I would argue, John, let me finish. I would argue to Bobby that just because we have been grossly inconsistent when it comes to China or when it comes to Saudi Arabia, which practices gross human rights, especially in the area of religious freedom, it seems to me where we have a policy where we try to hold to account the Castro brothers, I would argue that they ought to be indicted and held to account in the
Congressman Rush, just hold
as it relates to religious freedom. Let me just remind you that I am an ordained minister, a pastor of a church, and on Palm Sunday, I preached at a church in Havana. There was no restrictions of human rights there or religious freedom there. The people came and they freely, they were like, they could have been in any church in America. Let me also remind you that still today there are some U.S. prisoners, some prisoners in America who were activists during the 60s, who are political prisoners, who are still languishing in American jails.
All right, Congressman Rush, that's going to have to be it, I'm afraid. Congressman Rush, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Smith, thank you very much for being with us. You're watching Washington Unplugged on CBSNews.com.